Welcome to the Humor in Games podcast, an analog and video games podcast about how humor is experienced, designed, and analyzed in games.
We are Scott DeYoung,
Mark Lajeunesse,
and Andre Zanescu,
and we'll be your guides in this 6-episode series. Throughout each episode, we'll break down different theories and forms of humor. We'll draw on interviews with designers, critics, and academics as they discuss the different aspects of humor, their own lived experiences, and how their work utilizes humor in games. Today's episode is going to focus on the idea that humor can form communities or collectives. We want to highlight how humor within games presents individual and collective values that bring people together through laughter. We want to touch on a concept known as constitutive rhetoric, which the authors Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner have employed in the context of memes. According to them, memes are visual images with a text that use pop cultural references to make a statement, typically one that is funny and/or ironic. And because memes use visuals that people might recognize from a movie or a TV show alongside words that change the meaning into something humorous, they are an effective template to make jokes about specific values. Constitutive rhetoric in the context of humor understands that jokes present specific ideas, values, or opinions that resonate and form a targeted audience. Dr. Kashona Gray discussed a broad example of this in the context of the game Grand Theft Auto, where player interpretations of the game clearly vary between black and white culture. She said,
the only game that I could think of was GTA. GTA would be the game that I would say I would define as like a humorous game that we can engage in, right? So whether people think it's like a real, it's close to real life, or it's like satire and it's like a parody of the Black experience in America, that could be the case. But the thing that I think makes it so funny, like for Black people, is that it really took like this look at like just the everydayness of what it means to be like Black, and it like just like sensationalized it, right? So for instance, engagements with the police. Think about how thirsty the police are, like when the Black character comes around, right? They're immediately on him. Whereas like when you're playing like like the white character, they're not as aggressive. Now some people will be like, oh my gosh, this is so awful, oh my gosh, we have to like address this. Black people laughed at that. We laughed because it's like, this is true. Maybe somebody else will like finally see like the things that like we've experienced, like the things that we're talking about, right? And I also think that, so for instance, the Black character, when we engage him, he still lives in the hood. He lives in like in the ghetto, and he lives in like a very like a shanty town, right? Now, granted, any other person who's like looking at this, would be like, oh my gosh, the poor condition of these Black folks. Oh my gosh, they live like this. Oh my gosh, what do we need to do to help? Black folks are laughing because we're like, that's hilarious. That looks like the bodega right there. That's my granny house right there. Like we're like laughing because here it is. Our actual life that's just being like trying to, people are trying to make like these lives like legible to like these folks, right? And like recognizing that they would never be able to capture the holistic nature, still just like superficial, like surface level, right? So we have to laugh at it.
Dr. Gray's discussion emphasizes the varied responses and perspectives that players have towards content. As they argue, GTA presents an essentialized and superficial image of the Black experience. For some, this depiction isn't funny at all. For others, they're laughing at how essentialized the everydayness of being Black is in the game. If you remember back to episode 1, Dr. Gray highlighted Kevin Hart's Laugh at My Pain. In this conversation about GTA, she expands on that idea to discuss the need to laugh at these interpretations because of how problematic they are. This argument highlights the variance in interpretation that humor in games have. Dr. Gray's example of laughter is specific to a community of players, and as they note, not every player of GTA is finding these moments as humorous. This is important to consider in the games we play or create. Different communities will engage with content, bonding around ideas for various reasons. In the example of GTA, community humor bonded through the hyper-real essentialism of aspects of Black experience and popular culture, but it's important to remember that it isn't just a Black audience laughing at these elements. Thinking back to episode 1, what may be self-reflective jokes to a Black audience playing Grand Theft Auto may become jokes at the expense of an outgroup when these essentialized elements are interpreted by players who don't understand the essentialized and hyper-real elements of what is being depicted in GTA. Continuing this, Dietrich Squinkhofer, also known as Squinky, takes this notion of community creation one step further. To them, the social bonds created by humor are derived from individual interpretations, which allow humor to be used as a signal to specific communities that content is made for them.
There is definitely the social bonds aspect to it. And it's also kind of a way that because humor is incredibly subjective, it's a way of like signaling who I am trying to communicate with, and I guess who my audience is. My sense of humor is very much a product of like me and my circumstances and the people I am in community with. So like humor is kind of a way to like signal to members of communities I'm part of that like, hey, this is a game for you. And like when you're part of communities who don't like historically have a lot of like games made for them, or who aren't like the kind of audience that like big game companies have in mind when they make games. This is kind of a way of being like, hey, this is a game for you.
So humor can actually be used in very specific ways to form a community. Social bonds created through funny content can be used to engage with specific audiences and bring people together around an issue. Coming back to constitutive humor, we can understand how games use specific moments that target specific players, which in turn create a community that laughs at similar content. Designer and scholar Edith Hoff reflects on this when they discuss feminist humor.
A feminist humor, or there are many kinds of humors that are positioned at the margins, that we understand in parallel to the mainstream humor. I mean, and I think that's the case, right? We don't all share the same humor, which I think is okay.
The idea of humor positioned at the margins helps encompass what Ida, Squinky, and Dr. Gray are getting at. Communities form around jokes or interpretations of jokes that directly challenge the mainstream tropes or stereotypes that are dominant in games or just culture generally. So far, it's fair to say that humor is useful in helping individuals laugh together around a punchline as it was designed or specifically interpreted by a particular community. Dr. Gray's earlier example of GTA was focused on a relatively general game and the varied interpretations and relationships to it. However, continuing with the suggestions of Ida and Squinky, we can begin to understand the collective as a much smaller group. A good example of this experience is Edith Hoff's collaborative game, Cunt Touch This.
Yeah, it was my very first Unity game that I made over a weekend together with 3 other friends. And it's basically, well, I think about it as a meditative drawing game in which so Chicory in the 60s, she made a coloring book. Well, she drew her friends' vulvas, like very, very detailed, very beautiful. Like when you look through this coloring book, it's very beautiful, and you can just see how much diversity there are. Mm-hmm. And my friend had brought this one. We were at a game jam in a rural area in Denmark, and my friend had brought this one, and we were sitting in this, our locker room or where we were sleeping, and we were just, browsing through this, and we thought it was really, beautiful and funny and interesting, and because I didn't have any programming skills in Unity, so I was just like, okay, let's, make it into a drawing game. And that's what it is. It's a very, very simple game. It's for tablets, like for touch screens, and you kind of draw these vulvas. And then there's one sound effect, which is very evocative. And and that's it. And then when you have over a certain amount of time, it kind of explodes into this orgasm, and that's it. And that, when we were making that, we were very much in our own bubble. It was in a game jam that is male dominated and all that, but we were in our own bubble of having our own jokes and just prioritizing each other. And then I remember at the end of the game jam, it was like this bubble just burst, because suddenly there was like a lot of, there was just like a lot of drama around this game. It won some kind of award, and some people got really angry and started discussing, and then the person who gave the award broke down in tears, and it was like so dramatic. And it was such a contrast between like this meditative drawing experience that we were aiming for, and then the kind of shock value that this game certainly had. Over time, we have developed this concept of broception, which is this idea of the way that this game has been perceived by male audiences as this, I don't know, like in many different ways, but as this like shocking kind of humorous, awkward, embarrassing, shocking kind of statement. Whereas for us, it was a very meditative, healing kind of experience.
So Kunt touched this, and the reception to it is a strong reflection of how humor can be deeply tied to subject position, or in other words, individual experiences. For these independent designers, humor within games is a balance between them and their audience, a balance that typically leans towards the designer's preference. This is reflected when Squinky discusses their relationship between their design process and audience.
I put a lot of myself into my games, but the reason I'm making games in the first place is so that I can share them with others and so I can communicate something to others. So I am thinking about my audience, but I'm also thinking about it's like I'm not necessarily thinking about creating something universal because that doesn't actually exist. I'm thinking about it's like especially as a kid, like growing up pretty lonely and misunderstood for a lot of reasons. Like one of my driving forces when I decided to start making art and games and sharing it with other people is like I want to find other people who are like me and who understand like my experiences and what I've gone through and my sense of humor. Um, because like a lot of games, a lot of art aren't necessarily made with people like me in mind. So yes, I am thinking about my audience, but I am trying to like kind of with the intent of finding my people, if that makes any sense.
If we connect what both Squinky and Ida are saying as independent designers, humor in games creates a shared space of laughter that is between them, the designer, and their specific audience. The option to find one's people through humor is important for curating the space. However, Squinky and Ida are able to do this because they're independent designers and not large game companies. The idea of a targeted audience humor that can challenge dominant norms or make a political statement is a much more challenging task for a AAA game studio. Osama Dorias, the lead designer for the Warner Brothers game Gotham Knights, discusses the difficulties that these companies have in designing humor.
Across any of the studios I worked in, like at Gameloft, we had a list of topics that we couldn't bring up. And there are a lot of reasons for this, of course, but mostly it's just to mitigate risk. I mean, it's a risk reward. It's a business. The people have this is the primary goal of these big companies. Obviously, is to make money. So um, if the controversy is likely to lose you sales, that's the thing that's going to end up on the cutting room floor. While for indies, like especially smaller indies, where it's like they're more of a label like an artistic artistic endeavor. So they're more like, no, this is the messaging I want to get across. That kind of like in bigger productions, the goal is more to stay safe, and that makes a lot of sense. It's the same reason why we have like big productions are more sequels, because it's more likely to be easier to market, and like it follows the trends. Like don't take the risk, don't rock the boat. Like unless it's calculated, and unless we have, like take it. Like I'm not saying don't take any risk at all. But I mean, for something like this, why would you take a risk if it doesn't actually bring anything to your game? Just like leave it out, especially because they're like the reach of AAA games is so much wider. You have to find something that doesn't offend almost literally the entire globe, right? Like I know that's impossible, but like there's a Venn diagram of uh, what doesn't offend anyone at all. That's very very tiny.
Right.
So it's more about the bell curve. What can you get that's near the middle of that?
Brendan Keogh echoes Osama's point, emphasizing how the specificity of humor varies between AAA and independent games.
AAA has so many different issues where I guess when it comes to designing humor, designing anything, like firstly, the joke has to survive from the writer through the designer to the designer's lead to the creative director to the marketing person 2 countries away who has the editorial decision on and who has the spreadsheets about what's going to sell and what's not going to sell. And then they have their fixation on photorealism and the simulation working as designed, and they they can't be too offensive's like the wrong word, but they can't piss off that gamer audience that they've spent 20-30 years cultivating. So they're kind of like most of the time kind of like hamstrung into a certain kind of humor, which is more the Grand Theft Auto 14-year-old boy humor, because that remains the primary consumer demographic that AAA depends on, and which has put itself into a situation where it depends on it, as various researchers have kind of shown. Whereas, yeah, like an indie developer or a hobbyist or an amateur developer, an artist developer, like whichever way you want to split those, can just be like, I have an idea for a joke, jump onto Unity in half an hour, have done the bare minimum for that joke, and just put that on itch.io and be like, here it is, here's the joke. And then again, thanks to meme culture, thanks to all that, it can still spread quite easily. So yeah, I think like production environment is absolutely gonna in some way shape what kinds of humor you're more likely to produce. Yeah, and I think just like the AAA environment, again, speaking very, very broadly, is kind of is is so rigid in what it can and can't produce, and has to be if it's going to return the amount of money investors require and whatnot. So it's not really anyone's there. So like yeah, it's sorry, where am I going with that? Yeah, so because of that return on investment, it just has to play it safe, has to play it conservatively, and that kind of determines what can and can't, well, not what can and can't happen, but what is more and less likely to happen in that space. And I think that's why I see in like AAA games or whatever, most common humor I think is just this like punching down, pseudo satirical humor. It just hasn't figured out power exists yet. And like Grand Theft Auto is kind of a classic example where it's making fun of billionaire right wing politicians and poor refugee communities with the exact same brush, and like doing kind of satire, but doesn't seem in any way aware when that satire is actually directed at a meaningful target and when it's just and punching down and not in any way helpful. And so you kind of get that conservative pseudo satire in a lot of AAA video games, I think. A, because the target audience is 14-year-old boys, and B, because 14-year-old boys. Like who were the 14-year-old boys not very long ago?
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that's why that's still probably the most common kind of humor in at least AAA video games.
So there is a clear distinction going on here. On the one hand, we have independent creators who are making content that they want to make with a niche audience in mind, or perhaps no audience at all. And on the other hand, we have large game companies trying to make humor that fits for everyone. However, as Brendan suggested, this everyone is really more a targeted group of typically young men. Large game companies set the baseline of what humor is in games. Dr. Kashona Gray reflects on this.
Because I'm even thinking about what people find funny in these games. It's really like that, I call it like dude bruh comedy. I really think it was just like this particular brand of like white masculinity that does like just these over the top kind of like the culture of stupid. Even, you know what I'm saying? Like, just think about like the things that are very popular, like on YouTube, and think about like these particular influencers that are like popular. They're just doing some of the silliest things. They're engaging on like the silliest pranks, and that's just not stuff that like for the most part Black people find funny. And I think what's even more like depressing is whenever I see like these Black influencers and these Black figures in these spaces adopt those same kind of practices, because those are the things that are going to get them hits and clicks and followers and likes and people to subscribe. Hit that like button, whatever they're doing. Those they really have to. They're catering to a white template of like what's acceptable in those spaces.
Popular games and the culture around them create an expectation of humor. As Dr. Gray suggests, players and content creators adapt to the norms based on what is funny, what makes them money, and what is commonly seen or understood as a joke. This is a cause for concern, because not everyone finds this humor funny. If you remember back to the beginning of this episode, we talked about essentialized humor and humor at the margins. The idea that humor exists to signal to specific communities and run counter to this culture of the stupid or dude bra comedy. What Dr. Gray emphasizes here is how influential dude bra comedy is. The value of engaging in this typically white, straight, and male-focused form of humor can start to impact how other communities engage with humor. However, it is important that we have this humor at the margins. As earlier episodes discussed, jokes create in-groups and out-groups, and dude bra humor is no exception. This popular space of humor can actually be quite problematic, especially for individuals who exist in an out-group. As Squinky reflects, this humor can be quite harmful, especially when you grow up surrounded by this type of humor.
I have definitely experienced jokes in games, but also in general, that are meant to hurt people or mock people like me. Like jokes against trans people, like making fun of fat people, making fun of disabled people, like making fun of neurodivergent people. And that is something that kind of grew up with a lot of that kind of humor. And it was I didn't understand at the time how hurtful it was, but it definitely fed into a lot of internalized self-hatred, and that is absolutely something that I don't want to express in my own work. I don't want to hurt hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it, honestly.
So humor can be internalized. Our understandings of what is funny is related to the content we engage with as we grow up. Squinky's reflection emphasizes the value of considering our audiences and the in-groups and out-groups that might engage with our content. As Squinky mentioned earlier in the episode, humor creates social bonds and can signal to people that they are included in a joke. Creating games that engage with humor at the margins by critiquing these dominant and harmful forms of humor is just one step. For a designer like Squinky, the content they produce and how humor is embedded in it needs to actively consider the audience's reaction. Another independent creator, Narf, brings this back to Philip and Milner's concept of constitutive humor by discussing memes. As a reminder, memes are typically images with superimposed text that reference a specific event, experience, or idea to its audience. When relating them to games, Narf states,
I guess when you make those kind of images, it's still the same process. You're still thinking about the audience.
Right.
Like when I make a joke about the tools that we use at work that is terrible and slow, and I share the joke with my coworkers, I know they will find it funny. I don't share the same images with other people because they won't get the joke. So in a way, it's very similar. You always think about the audience.
It's time to revisit the focus of this episode, that humor is constitutive, or in other words, that humor in games have designed values and ideas that help form social bonds and identity. Through the symbols, actions, and goals of a game, humor brings players together. Importantly, the desire to maintain revenue for large game companies has created a baseline humor, or a humor for all, whereas independent designers or creators have the freedom to make a targeted or specific joke in their content. While the episode is focused on this idea of collective humor, it's important to consider one's individual position. What I mean is one's position in creating the game and its jokes, and another in how we individually find things funny. Any collective is created through individuals who share common values or goals. How we relate or struggle to relate to humor frames what will resonate with us when we come across it. Games offer such highly interactive and social frameworks to present humor. Considering this, the idea of humor for all isn't really for everyone. The jokes being made, whether intentional or not, will always include some people and exclude others. For these large companies, while they might try humor for all, it's really impossible, and it still typically results in humor for a specific demographic: young men. Of course, it is unsurprising that our interpretations of humor vary, and in that variance we find commonality. As game designers or players, we should consider what we find funny and why we find it funny. I ask you to question what jokes are being made and try to see who is included and who is not. Ask yourself what you find funny and why, or perhaps, even more importantly, ask yourself what are you supposed to find funny and why. Thanks for tuning in. Next time on the Humor in Games podcast, we will be talking about the relationship between humor and live streaming. Hope to see you there. I want to give a special thanks to our collaborators for this episode, Dr. Kashona Gray, Dietrich Swinkefer, Dr. Brennan Keogh, Ida Toft, Osama Dorius, and Narf.